Give us a sense of the top-line figures that you're most proud of that we should highlight.
Yeah, Jennifer, thanks for having us. We had a really great year in 2023, obviously on the back of a few tough years for our industry. So our earnings were up 18%. Our cash earnings were up 21% at a per share level. Our returns were up 19.5% at a per share level, if you adjust for some of the currency moves and so on. We have very strong new business. The value of our new business is up by 19%, and we've increased our dividend by 11%. So it's been a really great year for us, and we're very, very happy about that.
You said the value of the new business is up. I mean, where is that value coming from? Where are you seeing that growth?
Yeah, so look, we've surprisingly had really strong growth even out of South Africa. Strangely enough, on the rest of the African continent, we didn't have such great growth in 2023 after several years of really very high double-digit growth. And then, of course, in India, we had, again, very strong growth as that economy continues to power ahead.
Were you surprised that you didn't see more growth outside of South Africa? I mean, I know South Africa is really the base for the company, but were you surprised that you didn't see any more throughout the continent?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, we actually saw very strong growth in our general insurance book. But in the life insurance book, actually across the rest of the continent, we were a little surprised because the opportunity is still large. But, many of the countries on the continent are still suffering with fiscal issues, consumers under pressure and so on. So I think although we remain optimistic in the long term, that was possibly a bit of a dull spot for us in growth in the year.
So what does that mean then in terms of the growth and especially if you think about Sanlam and its position in terms of being a market leader, how does that get you any closer, or potentially a little bit further back from that?
Yeah, look, I think, we've completed a big transaction in September with Allianz to create really a new giant on the African continent. And actually already this year, we're beginning to see some very good performance out of that business. So we do think that joint venture is going to help our growth prospects on the continent tremendously. And I think also sometimes one has to be a little bit patient. I mean, post-COVID, all economies around the world, I think, have struggled a little bit, but particularly the more fragile ones have been under some fiscal pressure. So that puts pressure on consumers. But we're really we take a long-term view on these markets, and we're still very optimistic about, the African markets.
Are you planning then for more transactions similar to that Allianz deal that you talked about?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. Honestly, there was only across Africa for us, there was only ever going to be one big deal. And we've really created, I think, something very special. And now it's going to be just a question of that business itself, building itself over the next few years, taking opportunities as they arise. Surprisingly, although it is very well diversified and positioned in most of the big economies, there are still gaps in our portfolio, and we'll try and fill those in together with Allianz over time. But there's no rush, to do that.
So in terms of those gaps, no more acquisitions then? Because Sanlam has really been on an acquisition spree. Are some of those gaps potentially going to be filled there?
Yeah, look, I mean, in Africa, one needs to be very patient. So we know that we have gaps in some of the really big economies where in long run, it's going to be important for us to be better positioned in certain instances. But we need to be patient and wait for the opportunities, to come along, and we'll be ready to take them when they come. So we won't say there'll be no transactions, but we're not in any rush to do anything either.
So nothing in 2024. Paul, I also want to ask you about the pension system here in South Africa, because there's a lot of talk about this two-pot system overhaul that's actually going to be happening.
Yeah.
And there's some concerns in particular about the outflows that we could potentially see. I know the industry was able to get the deadline pushed back to September, but it's still coming. I mean, are you concerned about what we potentially could see?
Yeah, look, I think actually I divide my answer into two pieces. So I think I think South Africa. Let me go back a little bit. South Africa has a very, very good pension system. The private sector has done an incredible job here, and if I look at what we've got in South Africa relative to the rest of the world, even developed economies, we should be really proud of what we have. But clearly, we've got a fragile economy. We've been through a very tough period, and so one of the problems of pension funds is access to funds. Now, it's really important that people don't access their pensions for the wrong reasons early on, because we all know that actually time, patience with investment is critical. Building up your pension, is a task of great patience. And if you withdraw money, you really set things back. But having said that, we fully recognize that there is a need for this. And I think in the short term, yes, there is likely to be some outflow. I'm personally not as pessimistic as other people about the quantum of that outflow. I think actually a lot of savers really value what they have and be quite cautious about taking funds out of their pension. But in the long run, our modeling shows that actually this could be very good for the pensions industry, because while in the short term you'll get a withdrawal of historic funds that are built up, actually if it makes pensions more attractive to people, because there is a little bit of flexibility and ability to access funds, actually that may help grow the whole industry. So in the long run, we're not at all pessimistic about this thing. I think the biggest challenge in the short run is the practical implementation of it, and that's where there's a big concern in the industry. We don't know yet whether the tax authorities are geared up to handle it, because they still have to provide people with permissions and so on. So I think there's likely to be quite a lot of grit in the practical implementation of it, and that is a concern, because we obviously don't want to disappoint clients who want to withdraw money with cumbersome processes, but that may be forced on us by an inability of the tax authorities to fulfill their obligations as well in time.
So do you think we're likely to see this actually come to fruition in September, or potentially will it get delayed?
Well, I mean, things can always get delayed, but our base case is that it will go ahead in September.
And so then how do you as a group then plan for this? Because you mentioned in the long term, potentially it makes pensions more attractive. In the short term, it's millions and trillions potentially of rand. I mean, how do you prepare?
Yeah, look, I mean, how do we prepare? We've obviously, most of the assets sitting in investments are liquid, and the markets are deep and liquid. So there's no problem in preparing for it. It's much more, in my opinion, going to hinge not around preparing on the asset side, but preparing for communications to clients, making sure that they're taking informed decisions, and then practically processing withdrawals.
And Paul, I mean, another big topic that we've been talking about a lot here in the country is this the NIH bill, which is somewhat trying to replicate what we're seeing in the UK with the NHS. The other day we were talking to the Nedbank CEO, and I want to quote what he said. He said this bill is unaffordable, unimplementable, and unconstitutional. Do you agree with that assessment? How would you describe it?
Yeah, look, I'm not sure I would use quite the same language to describe it. I think our Constitution requires us to provide universal health care. Certainly, we think that is something that can be done in this country. I do believe that one of the key issues is what exactly the minimum benefits are. These have not been laid out. So when people say that it's unaffordable, that is based on an assumption, and I would go so far as to say speculation, as to exactly what those minimum benefits are. If they cast at the right level and build up over time, it may well be affordable. The other thing is that the private sector, the private health sector in South Africa is unbelievably good and is able to deliver, I believe, a lot of what the country needs. In fact, I'm told that the private sector can offer a hospital bed for less than the public sector. So one of the big issues is efficiency. And actually, if we could have the right public-private partnership in this space, it actually could be, very good for the country. So I don't start out as negative about the bill. I think there are a lot of undefined pieces about it that will need to be dealt with. I think one of the big dangers is that the determination of those benefits are that'll be provided in terms of the national health insurance are left in the hands of a single person, as I understand it, and that clearly can be pretty dangerous. So I think that's probably the area that needs to be addressed. And the other side of it would be the financing. How should it be financed? And how much is needed depends on the level of benefits. You can go back in the circle. So I think there's lots of work for everybody to do, in this area. But I don't think it's necessarily, the disaster that the sort of quote that you've rolled out, and maybe you provided other context around that. But as you put it to me, we wouldn't categorize it as such.
That's fascinating. That's definitely a unique view in terms of the private sector here in South Africa, Paul.
No, I think our private sector is, in the health area is really world class, and I think they could scale up and provide services to the public sector really well. So I think there are a lot of opportunities. That's the thing. Whenever you talk to people, their perspective on things will be driven by their own situation. But I do believe that there are parts of our private sector that could benefit from the right implementation of this kind of move.
And Paul, let's just finish on risk, because a lot of people are talking about the numerous list of risks potentially in 2024 for a number of countries. In particular, in South Africa, there's climate risk, potentially political risk, and logistical risk. I wonder, as an insurer, what concerns you most in terms of risk premiums going up?
Yeah, so look, I think it depends on which kind of insurance you're talking about. So, let's talk about general insurance, property and casualty insurance, which we do out of Sanlam. The thing that worries us the most is actually the infrastructure in South Africa. So, climate change is something that's a collective task to deal with for everybody on this planet. But in the short run, there's not much we can do about it. And it is true that the world is facing many more catastrophes, natural catastrophes. But the issue is actually how you respond to them. So is your infrastructure able to deal with more rain, with fires and so on? So when we have fire departments that don't have, the right equipment, when we don't have drains that are properly maintained and so on, these are all problems. So we've got, huge initiatives across nearly 100 municipalities to try and address infrastructure. But for us, that is, probably the thing that worries us the most. And the sad thing is about it, that we can actually do something about that risk as a country. We need to get on and do that. If you talk about the other part of our business, our asset management and life insurance business, there we're, much more concerned about, inflation, interest rates, and markets. And, we all know that particularly US markets, are at really very, very high levels of valuation. So lots of risk there. Inflation has proven very sticky, around the world. And we've got so many countries going into, election time. So clearly a lot of potential risk for stock markets around the world, and particularly, the big stocks that have been driving, the big indices. There is a lot of risk, and clearly there are reasons that the stocks are at those levels. But if any of those reasons fall away, and the hope around AI falls away, we're going to see a big correction, and that'll be an issue for our industry that we'll be concerned about. And probably the other big risk that we'd be concerned about is for the consumer. So we definitely need to see the South African consumer having some of the pressures reduced on them. Big risk around consumers and their ability to spend and save over the next couple of years.
Yeah, we'll see how that plays out. Have to leave it there, though. Paul Hanratty, really appreciate your time, the Sanlam CEO, joining us from Johannesburg. Thanks so much, Paul, for speaking with us.